Okay, so I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Olivia Swenson. I'm the founder of Olivia Edits, which is really just myself, but I'm a business of freelance editing, and I love working with Owl Hollow Press. Um, sorry for, I'll just apologize at the outset. I moved into a new apartment today with my family, so I'm a little spacey, I guess. I'm not sure what word you want to use to describe my state of mind. Um, but I'm really happy to be here. I love OHP's books. They're some of my favorite to work on, which is why they were the first publisher I wanted to work with after I had my daughter in January. And so I just love their stories and their authors, and I'm just really happy to work with them. So I've been editing since 2013. I got a minor in editing from Brigham Young University where I did my undergrad. And then I started freelancing as a full-time gig in 2016. And I freelance, so that means I work with lots of different publishers and also authors who are trying to get published. And I like doing developmental editing, which is just kind of the big picture stuff. I also do some copy editing, which is more focusing on grammar. Um, so yeah, that's just a little introduction to myself. I grew up in Southern Maine, so if there's any New Englanders, hi. Okay, but let's jump into some tips on if you're a writer and you have, say, your first draft of a story and you think it's pretty good. Here are some tips that can maybe tighten it up, strengthen it even more. And these are kind of things that I see again and again in the books that I edit, some pretty common errors that I think authors could tighten up themselves without having to before the book even sees an editor or publisher. So the first thing or the first issue I want to talk about is what your secondary characters look like in your story. So what is a secondary character? A secondary character are characters that appear repeatedly in your book, but they aren't the main character. So they serve to add to the depth of the world you've created in your story. They reveal something about the main character. They just generally progress the story in some way. So they're really crucial to the world you've created, the story you've created, feeling realistic. Imagine a world where only the main character is described in detail and there's a nameless mass of people who populate everywhere the main character goes. That's what a story would look like with no secondary characters. Or imagine a world with a main character who has four friends who are clones of each other in action, word, looks. That's when secondary characters are too similar, which is another problem. So the two problems are lack of secondary characters and really similar secondary characters. So when I was working on These Wicked Waters with Emily Lane, this was published last year by OHP, the main character Annie is working on an island resort as a maid. Well, she does lots of different jobs there, but at the beginning she's a maid, and she meets a group of other maids on her first morning. And I thought Emily described these co-workers that Annie has really beautifully. They really came to life in just this one interaction, but then they weren't mentioned again in the rest of the story. And so I queried Emily, and I was just kind of like, these characters could add a lot to this world of working as a maid on this resort that Annie's living in right now. So do you think you could try to bring them in a little bit more throughout the story? And Emily did a really good job in bringing in those maids, and they became a much bigger part of the story. And it was really neat to see Emily kind of take that query and run with it. So her story was a lot stronger for it. So when you're looking at your story, consider the following. Who are your secondary characters? If you don't have any, why don't you? How could your plot be strengthened if a secondary character was introduced maybe as comic relief or as an unexpected ally or a mysterious benefactor? There's lots of cool roles secondary characters can play to strengthen your story. If you do have secondary characters, be sure they're each serving a unique purpose. So I would recommend making a list of their physical attributes, their backstories, their personality traits, and their role in the story, and then kind of compare them to see if any two are really similar to one another. And if they are, maybe combine the ones that are similar or cut one out, which sounds awful to cut one of your characters, but sometimes it's really needed to make a story stronger. And another way you can tell if your secondary characters are unique is just by looking at any line of dialogue in your story. If you can read a line of dialogue and you can know right away who is saying it, that means your characters have a really good, distinct voice. Um, and so that shows that your secondary characters and your main characters are well developed. If you can't tell who's talking unless you read the dialogue tag, which identifies, like he said, she said, and identifies who was saying that line of dialogue, then consider how you can make that character more distinct, more unique. So that's my tip number one is analyzing secondary characters. So tip number two is talking about injuries. When your characters get injured, in almost every book I've edited, somebody gets hurt. Um, this isn't in a book, but one of my favorite parts in, I forget which Batman movie it is, but Christian Bale breaks his back and he recovers from it while in the prison um, where Bane grew up. And it was just a really cool way to incorporate the fallibility of Batman. He got his back broken, but also incorporate the backstory of the villain. And I thought that was a really awesome way of, I don't know if it was realistic, the time frame in which he healed from his broken back. Um, but I thought that was a really cool way to show that the main character got hurt and then had to heal from it, but made that healing process an interesting part of the story. Um, so that's probably the biggest problem I see with injuries is that the recovery time of the person who is injured isn't realistic. Like in The Ghost and the Wolf by Shelley X. Leon, her main character Penelope breaks a rib, and later in that same scene, she's climbing on top of a roof, and it just didn't fit right, you know. As a reader, you're like, wait, is that right? And so Shelley and so I just queried Shelley and I was like, um, maybe do some research on a broken rib and figure out, how long the recovery is, what kind of pain the person might have, what kind of pain medications would help her be able to get through the rest of the story because she has a pretty intense role. Um, so yeah, and then so Shelley ended up adding in some more reminders to the reader that Penelope was still experiencing pain as she was kind of going about her day-to-day actions. Um, and so yeah, she kind of rewrote some scenes to make that broken rib more realistic part of her story. So questions to ask with injuries are, number one, if your main character is injured, make sure it's an injury that doesn't prohibit them from accomplishing what they need to in the plot. So if somebody breaks their back, they're going to be out of the story for a long time, and it's really hard to make that recovery interesting like Batman did, especially since Batman's a movie. But so just maybe you need to modify the injury to something not so serious, or maybe you can get creative and figure out a way to make that recovery time interesting for the reader. But definitely kind of do your research and see how long it takes to recover from the injury. Is that recovery time accurately expressed in your story? You can't have somebody pitching a baseball if they broke their wrist a week ago. So just kind of look for those kind of mistakes. And then in some cases, there might be an explanation. Like I think when Penelope broke her rib, she was able to climb on top of the roof because of adrenaline. So there are sometimes these like backdoor shortcuts. They're not really shortcuts, but just these other ways to explain how characters are able to do something that would seem impossible. And especially if there's like magic in your story or something like that. And then also something to consider is what type of pain is expected during recovery and how you can work that into your story after the injury. So does the character walk with a limp or feel lightheaded more often, or just things like that that remind the reader, oh yeah, I'm still injured, but I'm still, carrying on with the story. So those are my tips on writing realistic injuries. Okay, tip number 3 has to do with geography. So when you're writing a story, there's going to be well, it might depend. Some stories have lots of different settings. You think of Lord of the Rings, he created a whole world. Created a whole new world oftentimes. Yeah. Or Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series, that's a whole world. but you want to make sure that the world is consistent. So if it takes a group of people 6 months to walk from A to B, it needs to take another group of people 6 months to walk from A to B. You can't have one group get there in 6 months and another group of people get there in 1 month. So you need to, I would recommend drawing a map of your world. Sometimes your setting might just be your main character's bedroom. And in that case, your map would look like, where's the bed? Where's the window? You don't want to have the sun coming up in the window and waking the character up, and then the character watching the sunset from that same window, because that wouldn't make sense. So you want to mark down kind of the orientation of things. And it's a lot easier when, if you already have a story written, you just kind of copy and paste everything that has to do with geography, traveling between points A and B, the relation of where things are to each other, copy and paste it into a separate document, and then kind of create your map from that, either a physical drawing map, or you can write out the details that describe the setting or the world. As an editor, I do this as part of the style sheet that I create. And I really recommend that all writers create their own style sheets for books, for the books they write. Style sheets are just it's kind of like the master resource for the character, what characters look like, any unique phrases that are said in the book. Like in Platform Dwellers by Katerina Boudreau, that book is set on a platform, an oil platform in the ocean, and they have been away from kind of mainstream people for hundreds of years, and so they have come up with their own phrases, like tidal means really cool, or I think one of them was thank the crusty barnacles or something. So I made as part of your style sheet, you kind of make a list of all these unique aspects of your book, and geography is definitely one of them, because you want to keep those details readily available to yourself, so that as you're writing, you can think, wait, how far is it from this person's house to this person's house, or how long did it take him to travel to the ocean from his house, or whatever, just to get those details consistent. When I was editing Witches of Willow Cove by Josh Roberts, which I love all of OHP's book, but I really loved this book. Robbie and his friends use a tunnel system to get around their town of Willow Cove, and there were several entrances to this tunnel system, and they didn't seem to quite match up as far as where they came in and then where they came out, and how long they were spending in the tunnels. It just wasn't quite matching up. So it was a really easy fix for Josh to make, but it really just added to the depth and made just the world feel more real and the characters feel more real. So that was a really easy fix. So so that's another thing that would be really easy for an author to do on their own, is just to analyze their own geography. Another story in These Wicked Waters again. So I think it's really interesting when stories all take place in just one setting, because the author can really kind of delve into the unique attributes of that setting. So I thought it was really cool that all of These Wicked Waters, basically all of it, takes place on one island. So she could really get into kind of the details of the island, and that's something to take into consideration. Sometimes it's nice for a reader to not have to keep visualizing all of these different places if you're dragging them along with the main character on a quest or something. But if the whole story is on one island, then it can kind of help the reader get a really good visual of what's going on. And obviously stories can be successful if there's lots of settings or just one. But I really thought Emily did a good job of writing a complex single setting for her story. Okay, and then the last tip that I have has to do with conversations between your characters. And I kind of mentioned this earlier as far as being able to identify whether or not your characters have a unique voice by reading just one line of dialogue. But this is more talking about how to smooth your conversations out and how to make them easier to read for the reader. And by easier, I mean giving the reader a really clear picture of what's going on in the conversation, not only with the words, but with the body language of those who are speaking, those characters who are speaking. So my first tip would be to cut out unnecessary dialogue tags. And dialogue tags which I think I mentioned earlier, are those he said, she said that are tagged onto the end of lines of dialogue. So if you have he said or she said or you know, Josh said or Abby said after every line that they say, even if you use a different verb, even if you don't use said, it just gets really repetitive. Hopefully, your characters have that distinct voice. So even if you crossed off, deleted that he said, she said, that dialogue tag, you'd still be able to identify who is speaking. Another way, sometimes it can be confusing, even if the voices of your characters are really distinct, it can be confusing who's talking. And so instead of having that dialogue tag, you can use body language. So you can preface somebody's dialogue by something that they do with their body. Like if one of your characters has long hair, she could maybe, tuck her hair behind her ear. That's kind of a overused one, but there's lots of things. They can make eye contact. Characters can, fix the clasp on their watch, or there's lots of unique body language that you can use to kind of remind the reader in a natural way that this person is now talking. And so I do see a lot of he grinned, she smiled, he chuckled. There's a lot of body language that's maybe overused. He crossed his arms. He folded his arms. Playing with your hair. There's just a lot of overused body language cues. And so my recommendation would be to kind of dig into your character's specific attributes that would maybe lend them toward one type of body language over another. So maybe if your character wears fake eyelashes a lot, maybe she can always be, fixing her eyelash or something. Or maybe one of your characters is an older man who has a large watch, and when he's nervous, he always is like fiddling with it or something. And so you can really dig into your character's, unique attributes and just bring your specific character to life even more by giving them specific body language. And obviously don't overdo it either. You can't have this man always fiddling with his watch every conversation, because that will get old too. But it's just another opportunity for you to make your characters a little more developed and feel more rich. So I worked on this a lot with Jenny Bardsley. Her nom de plume, is that your pen name, is Louise Cypress. She wrote Narcosis Room and the sequel Quick Fix, which I don't think has come out yet. But she has a tendency of writing really good dialogue. Like it's really easy to pick out who's talking, but she has less body language than I think is sometimes needed to make the conversation feel more real to the reader. And so we kind of worked on that in both Narcosis Room and Quick Fix. We worked to just add more body language. And specifically, I was looking for body language that explained the reaction of the main character, Ellie, to what was going on. Because a lot of times when you're working with the first person kind of narrator, you can really dig into their emotions, and you kind of need to, because the story's being told from their perspective, and you need to know, even if it's a flawed perspective, you need to know what they're thinking as much as possible. You as the reader needs to know that. And so if there's this conversation going on that is really critical to Ellie, but she wasn't really interjecting her thoughts into the conversation that was happening, then it kind of felt distant, like was Ellie even there? Anyways, I don't know if that's making any sense, but we just worked to, add the body language that was appropriate to those conversations to make the conversations feel a lot more real. And I think it really made those conversations come more alive. So those are my four tips. I have a tendency of talking really fast when I'm nervous, so that's why that took a lot faster than I hoped. But I would be more than happy to answer any questions that you guys have now, if you guys have any. Or let's see, I'll read these comments on the side here. Yeah, yes, when people roll their eyes, that's another really common one. Groaning, yes, sigh. Sighing is super common. Yeah, luckily um, there's just a lot of other options for body language that you can use that isn't so overly used and just feels like to readers that they almost gloss over it because it's so overused. Okay, so do I have a specific editing process I recommend for authors that authors follow in editing, like editing in layers or different passes for different problems, etc.? That's a great question. So it's funny because I don't even have a system that I use every time for every book, and it's my job. So it's kind of up to how you feel and you understanding your own workflow. A lot of times when I get a book to edit, I'll do recently, this has not always been my process. I'll do one quick read through just to kind of get my first reaction to the story. And then I'm making comments about like, oh, this doesn't make sense, or this was kind of a letdown, or this worked really well. I'll just leave little comments on the side. And then I'll go back and kind of give it a more deep edit, where I make the style sheet. I copy and paste a lot of information from the story into a separate document that I organize by characters and place and phrases and vocabulary and blah, 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 so that I can keep everything consistent. But as far as for authors, self-editing their own work, I would say once you feel like your story is as strong as you can make it, there are ways you can look for repeated word. Like if you're just looking for um, ways to kind of step back and look at your document with new eyes, the 4 tips I just gave are good because they kind of allow you to look at different aspects of your story more analytically. Some other really common things that I didn't mention are making sure like your point of view character, that you always stick in the point of view that the character. So, for example, if you're writing in third person, which means there's not an I narrator, it's just a character that's narrating it. You need to make sure that the character who's narrating is always the one narrating, and that his friend's thoughts don't seep into the story, or that his mom's thoughts don't make it in there. So you want to make sure your point of view is always really consistent. You always want to tell the story from that character's point of view or that scene. You can change points of view if you have multiple narrators, but you just want to make sure that whatever narrator is narrating a particular scene, you want to stick with him. So that's one thing. So yeah, I guess after you feel like you have a good story, I would recommend trying to go about it more analytically. It's really hard to see more errors than that without an editor to kind of who has expertise in that in those developmental editing areas. It's really hard to identify those issues yourself. But the things I mentioned, when I think you can make a list for like secondary character similarities or your injuries or your geography, those kinds of things you can look at analytically. So I would recommend doing that um, after you feel like your story is good, after you feel like you've written a good first draft. Okay, how do I recommend giving characters distinct voices? That's another great question. So I'm a big believer in writing character backstories that might never make it into the book, but that as an author really informs your decisions as far as why your characters do what they do, how they speak, um, their insecurities, their strengths, their weaknesses. Their backstory should kind of inform all of these aspects of that character. So if you can't write a journal entry or a backstory, if you don't want to write a journal entry, if you can't write your character's backstory, the chances are they're not going to have a very distinct voice. And so I would definitely recommend writing the backstories as much in detail as possible, to give that character a more distinct voice. Maybe you realize that this person should have grown up in the South and they need a Southern accent, and so you start kind of changing their dialect a little and their dialogue. Dialects are actually a really great way to make a character more distinct just because their speech patterns will be different. It's also really interesting if a character is from a certain region, looking up, the phrases or the vocabulary and even the grammatical structure that's used in that region, and that will really make that character feel authentic to the readers if they kind of match up with the colloquialisms of the region that they're from. So that's a few, yeah, writing backstories and just making sure your character is realistic as far as talking like they should from wherever they're from. Those are two ways to make distinct character voices. Um, Fixing pacing issues. So there's a few ways to do this. I would recommend the way I do it is in an Excel sheet, I write down the main characters and the secondary characters that seem to have bigger roles in the plot. And I kind of mark at which point in the story they have a conflict or where tensions are rising. And if there is a part of the story that has no conflict or no tensions are rising on any of these main characters or secondary characters, then I know that part of the book is going to be really slow. And so a lot of times I can just feel it. And so I won't make that chart until after I've read the book. And then I'm like, wait, this part of the book, I might have made a comment like this part feels slow. Let's go back and see what's happening. And yeah, there's no tension, there's no conflict approaching or happening. And so to fix pacing issues, once you've identified them, I guess I was talking about identifying them. To fix them, you just have to make something happen. So uh, whether ideally it's something that sets up the bigger conflict later in the story. So in the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson, he's really good at setting up the next big thing. So at the time, there's two armies outside of Luthadel. I just read this book, so that's why these are coming to me quickly. There's two armies outside the city, the capital city in the book, and the main character needs to somehow save the city from these two armies. And right when you think she has a way to solve it, a third army shows up, and you're just like, what? And meanwhile, in the background, so that's like the big conflict. And meanwhile, in the background, these characters are being developed, their relationships are being developed. Information is being given to the reader that they need later in the story to kind of heighten the drama then. So you just need to make something happen and then continue developing what needs to be developed for the conclusion. And honestly, I would recommend just kind of asking yourself, what if this were to happen at this slow part in the book? What if, what if? And if you ask these questions to yourself, something will eventually click that you're like, oh, I can actually add that in and it's going to really strengthen my story. So that's how I would maybe think about fixing pacing issues. I'm not sure if that was very helpful. What is easier for me to edit, first person or third person? Well, I would say I like both, and I've worked extensively with both first person and third person. I'm not a fan of omniscient third person, so when all the characters' thoughts are around and kind of taking up space in the story. And that some books, I don't mind reading it. I just finished The Mysterious Benedict Society and I really loved it. And that's an omniscient third person. So you kind of hear the thoughts of the four main characters whenever they're in a scene together. But as far as editing, I think I prefer third person limited just because, well, I'm not really sure why, but that's just what I prefer. But I also like first person. I just like it when you can focus. I love being able to focus on one character's perspective and really delving into their own weaknesses and their own flaws and how they see the world. And I think that just adds to the story's richness a lot. So that's what I like. The hardest part of editing, that's a good question. I think I hesitate to speak for all editors, but I think all editors have to have a kind of inherent sense of perfectionism to want to become an editor. And so a lot of times the hardest part is just acknowledging and accepting that I'm going to return a manuscript and there will still be errors. I can't catch everything. And that's probably a healthy way to approach life, anyways, is that you're going to do the best you can, but stuff is going to happen. I'm really sorry about this fan. It just made me think shiz is going to hit the fan, and you just have to keep doing what you can. And that's how it is with, yeah, with editing too. It can be hard to um, work really hard on something, and then after the book is published or in later on, you realize, oh, I really miss this big thing. So it's hard not to regret missing things. Um, but that's life, and I've gotten a lot better at just being like, I tried my best, and I'm proud of how the story turned out. So I have to move on. Um, okay, these were great questions. Let me make sure I didn't miss any. Um, okay, sighing and snorting. Yes, Darby writes a lot of horse books, and so there's a lot of snorting, but I'm not sure how many other sounds horses can make. Harumphs. Actually, I shouldn't, I honestly don't even feel qualified to edit Darby's books because I have maybe ridden a horse once and somebody was leading me around a corral. So, um, okay. My favorite part of editing, and what made me want to become an editor. Thanks, Alicia, for these great questions. Okay, so when I was in college, I was majoring in international relations and I minored in editing. So my first career choice was as a foreign service officer because I love traveling and I love learning languages and I love just learning about politics and um, just learning about the world. But I've also always been a fanatic reader. My mom taught me to read from the 100 Easy Lessons, whatever, when I was 3, and there's a home video of my dad reading to me about photosynthesis when I was, I don't know, probably 3 or 4, and I just devoured everything I could get my hands on. My punishment from my parents was they would take away my book, um, and I would stay up late reading. I would get up early to read. I just loved reading, especially fiction. I loved reading fiction. Um, and so I think from all of that reading, I just kind of grasped this inherent sense of what makes a good story. And so that can be hard to talk about because some parts of editing are objective. You need a period at the end of a sentence. That's not really up for debate, except I guess in poetry, which I don't edit. So, but there's a lot of editing is subjective, especially developmental editing. When I'm saying, your conversation needs more body language. The author could come back and be like, I was actually going for kind of a cleaner look, like a cleaner conversation. I don't really want body language. I want the reader to kind of be guessing about this. And so yeah, a lot of it's subjective, which I actually love. I love talking with my authors about when they give me pushback on an edit because they're the expert in the story and I'm just working with them to make the best story they can. I'm not the expert, so I'm the expert in editing and I have my ideas about what makes a good story, but I want to bring their passion into this and they know their story, their characters, their plot, their settings. They know all of that and what they were intending to do when they wrote it. So it's really helpful to me when they push back and we have a discussion about, this might help or I take back this edit. Okay, anyways, so when I got married right after college, back to the story of how I became an editor. I got married right after I graduated from college, and I started freelance editing just on the side. I had a full-time job as a nanny at first, and then as a editor for an economics journal, which wasn't my favorite kind of editing, although I did find it really interesting because I think economics is really interesting. But I was editing fiction on the side in the evenings for almost no money. um, and then we moved to Lisbon, Portugal, and I didn't speak the language and I didn't have a job. And so I decided to turn my hobby of editing into a full-time career. And I just started cold emailing publishers, and we can have a whole nother conversation about if you want to become a freelance editor, but it's certainly an uphill journey to get noticed by publishers. But I just really love working with authors and I really love stories and what I learn from characters and how I just feel like a better person when I both from my interactions with the authors and from my interactions with their characters. And so it's just an extremely rewarding job. I'm not making the big bucks, but I feel like I have a really fulfilling life because I enjoy my career so much. And I really attribute that to how much I read as a kid. Um, so yeah, that was a really long answer, long rambling answer to your question about why I wanted to become an editor. My favorite part of editing is working with authors, I would have to say. I just really enjoy getting to know my authors and literally feeling their passion through their words, which I'm sure is the point of any author wanting to write, wants to, communicate their passion for their work, for their story. But I just think it's such a fascinating medium for communication is through stories. And I just love getting to know. It's a really vulnerable thing to share. Well, as anyone can think of, or if you've done it, then it's really vulnerable to share something you've written um, with somebody else, especially maybe it's easier a complete stranger, I don't know, rather than somebody but it's just hard to receive feedback from somebody. And so I just have a lot of respect for authors who offer up their manuscripts to me to be edited. That's really hard. And so that's probably my favorite part is working with authors. How many languages do I speak? I sadly only speak Spanish and Portuguese. I took a lot of Spanish classes and I need to live somewhere Spanish speaking now so I can really get that down. And then although I can read it. I can read Spanish and Portuguese really easily. Portuguese, I'm conversational in after living there for a year and a half. I wish I spoke all the languages. I think people who learn lots of languages are really fascinating. And they teach me a lot about English. So I don't write. I have a journal of story ideas that are bouncing around in my head. And it's sad because whenever I've tried to write, I have a hard time giving my own characters any kind of real depth. So they all come out as they have no problems, they're too perfect, or they're way too flawed, and they can't even get out of bed in the morning because they're just too flawed. Anyways, so I have a hard time of finding kind of the happy medium of a realistic character. But hopefully one day I do have a dream of writing a book. Not many people know this, but I would like to write, and it's because of the inspiring authors I work with, honestly. And it's not because I think I'm as cool as them or I'm as skilled as them, because I'm not. But I just really feel like I have stories inside me that I want to share someday. So maybe you'll see something from me at some point in the future. I appreciate all the nice things people have said about me in these comments, that I've made your story stronger. You had a great story, Candace. So there didn't need to be a lot of work there. Okay, I think those were all the questions. If anybody else has anything, you can also feel free. I mean, you can message this. Thanks, Darby. Yeah, anyways, if you want to ask any other questions, if you think of anything, then you can message Owl Hollow's Facebook page or leave a comment or whatever, and I'm sure I'll see it. But yeah, I was really glad to be able to share a few insights I have from being an editor. I don't feel like I'm super experienced, but I really do love what I do, and I'm happy to answer any other questions that you guys have at any time. And hi, Mom. And I'm really happy to be here and to be part of the Owl Hollow Press community, because they're great people and they have a great mission. And yeah, signing off.
Subscribe to our channel so you'll never miss an upload, or join us live every Thursday for author interviews, book clubs, writing advice, and more on Facebook at Owl Hollow Press, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. See you Thursday.